My introduction speech is very, very short. It's just basically to thank people mostly and give you a bit of overview of what this is all about. Well, in terms of thanking, well, first of all, we thank the FCDO, who is the big funder, but not only funder, so they provide us with the funding for the ReCIPE program, but also, of course, with a lot of input. So we love talking to them also in terms of content. So that's really, we're very grateful, especially in these challenging times when around the world aid programs get shut down. The UK approach of being evidence-based and try to do something that's aligned with science is a beacon of hope for good policy making. So we're really, really grateful for what you do. So a big thanks. We can even applaud, maybe. Then I also thank very much the CEPR, who are the organization that kind of runs this all in terms of leadership and logistics. So Bao Khan has done a lot of work. For example, Emma, Laura, Tessa, who unfortunately cannot be with us today. So they've done a tremendous job. And then, of course, Oliver van den Einde. So if it's written that it's organized by Oliver and me, well, it's actually, without exaggeration, 100% Oliver and 0% me. So I was even, too slow to answer email. So it's really Oliver who did the whole leadership here for this conference. So thanks so much. So that was also super. Thanks a lot to all of you. So what is it about? Well, so it's kind of to launch this program, ReCIPE. So ReCIPE has a few angles. So it's a small grant program, a small and medium grant program, a bit like Stag and Pedal, that are also FCDO funded. So many of you will know these famous programs. It will be about funding research on conflict by empowering people around the world. If you're the next Einstein but not sitting in a famous university, you also have a chance to do fantastic cutting-edge work. And so the goal is really to spread, to give access to cutting-edge research on conflict to everybody around the world. And so these grants are, of course, a really big pillar of what we do. They will start very soon, and there's also a newsletter that you can sign up. So for example, you could talk to Lauren, you could send an email. There's a QR code as well that will pop up at some point. So please sign up to the newsletter to get all the information on the grants starting kind of very soon. Second pillar of what we do are online courses. They will also start next month, where we're gonna, again, the courses are deep and cutting edge, but deliberately not super technical in the sense that everybody should find them accessible. So again, it's this goal of inclusiveness and of spreading out and outreach, and as a third big thing of what we do, especially in this first year of ReCIPE, are these so-called pathfinding papers, and they also structure the conference today. So you will see that each session basically has some label of one theme, and so basically the theme leader will talk about their theme. There are 9 different themes that cover kind of key aspects of conflict and peace. And each of these themes will produce a pathfinding paper, which is a bit like a journal of economic literature or annual review piece that gives a synthesis of the literature, asking the question, what do we know? Why do we care, and what should we know and we don't know yet? What are the gaps in the literature in order to help people to champion future research on this? And these pathfinding papers, they will then come out as a special issue of economic policy this autumn, and so to have a lasting legacy of this kind of tour de table, if you like. So that's kind of a bit the menu for today. without much ado, let me go to the first substantial contribution here, which is Austin, I think.
All right, so thank you all for being here. In part due to a series of technical difficulties this morning, the deck for Theme 1 is not here, but I want to thank Elena, who is the co-leader for Theme 1. Theme 1 is based around thinking about how can we build public policy interventions for peace. And so the primary focus of that first theme is thinking about the battery of interventions that we have studied collectively as a group here in the room, thinking both about the role of labor markets, thinking about the critical role of foreign aid, as well as thinking about other types of interventions that have been used to sort of change the political frameworks through which violence would otherwise be used as an intervention. And I think that the key thing that we are going to focus in on in terms of building out that pathfinding paper is ensuring that we're both engaging the literature itself, both thinking about what prior results have been identified, but also ensuring that we're doing a systematic review of the empirical evidence that we can bring to bear. And so there will be sort of varieties of classification in terms of the quality of the evidence, as well as a clarification of what we think of as the primary directions that the evidence is taking us in terms of those policy interventions. The ultimate goal, which I think may be slightly different than some of the other pathfinding papers, is that we will both be doing that deep engagement with the literature, but also with an explicit eye towards scalable policy interventions. And so, in the sort of post-research phase of my life, now that I have tenure, a lot of the work that I do is really focused in the operations arena. And so it's thinking about how do we take the hard academic work that we do as a research community and translating that into operations. How can we then go out into the world and use those insights to reshape and recast existing programs? And so part of our pathfinding paper is not just that review, which I'm sure all of the other theme leaders will talk about the substantive focus of their themes, but we'll also be specifically thinking about how can we take those insights and walk it to active policy interventions. Now, unfortunately, I am coming here from the United States, so I'm here from the University of Chicago, but part of what I did last week was spending a little bit of time in Washington, D.C., visiting with our alums who've recently been experiencing the fallout of the shift in the treatment of USAID, which we know is a global hit to the aid community. And so, of course, what we hear from both those who are on the ground in D.C. as well as those deployed globally is that now more than ever, the work of programs like ReCIPE is essential. So I want to thank you all for being here and hopefully identifying with that path and supporting that pathfinding work in the future, and Elena appreciates that as well. Okay. Happy to talk about those themes. I think one thing that Dominic pointed out that you all are probably aware of is that as we continue to grow out those themes, a core part of that mission is finding ways that we can support research. And so if you are, for example, working on anything related to labor markets, if you're working on any interventions having to do with sort of job programs or mechanisms for creating disincentives for engaging in conflict, or if you're doing any work related to foreign aid, we would genuinely like to hear about the work that you're doing, even if it's in its early stages, both so that we can incorporate it into that pathfinding project, but also as we think about building out some of those funding opportunities. And so that's both you in terms of those in the audience that are more senior researchers, but also if you've identified any promising graduate students, that is certainly opportunities that we would like to help develop and we want to nurture. One of the things that came out of our conversation last night, some of the theme leaders were talking about this, is a potential concern that, especially now with the United States retracting from the global position in terms of support for international development assistance, as well as a significant shift in the nature of conflict, there might actually be changes that we see in terms of graduate student interest in certain themes of research, including a shift away from understanding things like counterinsurgency or small wars. And so our fund exists to ensure that there are at least some incentives that remain to continue that really important research so that we don't lose focus on the small wars that unfortunately are the source of the vast majority of violence and human harm that we see in the world today. Our theme is really focused around policy interventions for peace building. And this is a project that's joint work with Chris Blair, who's now at Princeton, and the focus is on a massive sort of relocation program that happened in 2016. And so, just to highlight, I think for the room and maybe the folks joining us through the live stream, earlier I mentioned that small wars and sort of low-scale conflict, as in like not interstate violence, is the source of a tremendous amount of human suffering, probably the majority of all kinetic violence on the planet right now. And those small wars have very serious consequences for things like displacement. And so currently at this point, more than 40 million people are displaced across international borders. And unfortunately, what we're experiencing now, probably further accelerated by the withdrawal of the United States from support for international development, is the collapse of durable solutions. And so there are primarily three ways of dealing with or trying to reduce the consequences of relocation and displacement, which is one, thinking about resettlement. Another is thinking about naturalization. And what you see on these two left side panels is the fact that these remain relatively low in terms of their actual utilization over time. Unfortunately, repatriation, although it has also been used frequently, remains a collapsing option. The crucial thing for us, though, is that as we think about evaluating those potentially durable solutions, there's a dearth of evidence on the impact that they have on the environment itself. So there are major inferential challenges that we would have to deal with if, for example, we wanted to think about this in the Afghan context. One is that there's a wave of repatriation that occurs around the period of the collapse of the communist regime. Another wave of displacement occurs during the period of Taliban collapse during the early period, 2001. And then what we're going to be able to take advantage of here, though, is this unexpected cash assistance program that was announced in 2016 that actually led to a significant shift. And so that's going to be the blip that you see over here. Now, in terms of scale, it's significantly smaller than what you see in terms of relocation coming from either of the two regime collapses, but the first two are very obviously endogenous to conflict dynamics. And for our purposes, the last one gives us an opportunity to kind of look in at relocation as well as looking at policy interventions that might be able to reduce the harm associated with movement. Now, repatriation and conflict, of course, are endogenous themselves. We see this in a number of different contexts. This is, for example, some evidence from Iraq. There's also further evidence, from Serbia and Kosovo. There's evidence from Burma, as well as some evidence from Mozambique. And again, all of these are waves of repatriation, so relocation and return home, that are endogenous to conflict dynamics. And ultimately what we're interested in is identifying a shock and mass relocation that is not caused itself by conflict dynamics, but is induced by something else. And so in our case, what we're going to leverage is an otherwise unexpected shock to assistance. So overnight, repatriation cash assistance coming from UNHCR doubles. And so it was both unexpected and large scale. So during that particular window of time, the mass return from Pakistan to Afghanistan accounted for 66% of all returns documented during that cycle on a planetary scale. So you should think of this as a massive human scale return. It's also the shift that occurs is economically meaningful, right? So the assistance that was provided previously was non-trivial, but the doubling actually ends up being about $400 per returnee. And in terms of the average size family, that's going to be significant relative to the typical scale of the wages for full-time fighting in Afghanistan. Now, one unfortunate thing, or fortunate depending on this from the purposes of science, is that it also occurred at the start of the 2016 fighting season. So if you were following the Afghan conflict, one thing that you would see, if you ever looked at an over time figure with respect to the intensity of violence, is that there are fighting seasons in Afghanistan. And that fighting season typically begins in June. And so the program is announced in June, around the time when this wave of individuals returning that's economically vulnerable might actually be sort of ripe for recruitment, right? And so it's a natural concern that one might have that it could be lighting a fire in 2016 by inducing this massive scale return of otherwise vulnerable individuals. And so what we're going to take advantage of is the fact that we have really, really strong data on the historical resettlement patterns of returnees, which allows us to implement something like a Bartik-style DID. So we're also going to take advantage of the fact that we have, so Oliver and I and others in the room have been able to take advantage of historical data from this context, mostly coming from the United States military. What we have during this particular period is actually a different data set that is equally comprehensive, but was primarily collected by the Afghan National Forces themselves. And we were able to retrieve this through a declassification process with NATO. And these combat records will allow us to have a lens into an otherwise very vulnerable period of time where there is no such data. Okay. All right. So some of our core findings. The crucial thing to emphasize is that I sort of motivated the talk by saying the really hard problem to study is one of understanding the impact of mass-scale repatriation on conflict because it's often endogenous. This is not return in general. This is a particular kind of return, which is return that's induced by cash assistance. So I want to be very clear about the sort of scope condition of the type of return that we're talking about. However, what we're going to find is that even though this is happening during a period which would otherwise be incredibly vulnerable, right, what we end up seeing is that those that are returning with resources is associated with a significant reduction in insurgent violence. And what we're going to find, in line with some pioneering work done by some of us in the room previously, is that there is likely an opportunity cost channel that explains at least part of this. What we're also going to find, however, is that it significantly reduces counterinsurgent informing. And so for those of us who don't spend too much time thinking about military applications, what this means is that often the ability to engage in a counterinsurgency depends on the flow of information from the civilian population. Civilians are the ones who are the primary source of vital information from a military perspective. A shift in the flow of that information can be incredibly problematic, and what we can document in this case is in fact that. Because of our military records. Okay. However, right, so it's not all good news in the sense that it's reducing insurgent violence, and that's because actually those individuals returning are exposed to increased communal violence, and they're exposed to significantly heightened levels of discrimination. Right, so we're going to show you lots of evidence coming from surveys of those individuals that suggests that they were exposed to disproportionate harm on a communal level. Right. However, there are ways of thinking about mechanisms for offsetting that, which includes investing in social capital and strong local institutions. And so speaking to this idea of theme one really being about finding those policy interventions that can be used to enhance peace, one thing that we see here, just a kind of high-level overview of the results, is that indeed the use of cash assistance can reduce some of the potential harm of mass relocation, while also we need to be mindful of the fact that we're potentially exposing individuals to communal tensions unless we can ensure that their policy intervention is tied to strong local institutions. Again, that's a type of intervention that we might think about investing in. Okay, so thus far, the literature thinking about repatriation has primarily found that it worsens militancy. Why is that? Because there are natural concerns about the diffusion of conflict across borders, that this is a vulnerable population for recruitment, that often individuals returning from abroad are returning to instances of institutional fragility. It's also possible that these returns can worsen social conflict. So it could be that individuals returning may, while abroad or while returning home, engage in criminality. It could also expose them to instances of ethnic strife. There might also be competition over scarce resources like land and jobs. Now, I will say that almost all of these are relevant in the Afghan case, which we'll show you more evidence of here shortly. Now, it could be the case, however, that rather than worsening conditions on the ground, it might actually make them significantly better. And so it could be that we need to recognize that often when individuals are displaced and they spend a significant amount of time abroad, they actually acquire skills. They might actually have heightened self-efficacy, right? Now there might also be cases where these individuals bring with them spillovers in assistance. And so, of course, what we talked about earlier in mind, right? Those aid assistance programs might actually have beneficial effects through those recipients themselves. And so a little bit about the Afghan context. This is rather staggering. 20 to 30% of all citizens have been displaced abroad at some point, right? And so they could have been displaced abroad because of the Soviet invasion or the U.S. invasion or the collapse of the communist regime or the collapse of the Taliban or Taliban resurgence, or more recently with the second wave of Taliban resurgence. A large number of individuals in the Afghan context have been displaced abroad, right? Pakistan, as it turns out, is one of the sort of top 5 global host countries for the last 42 years, and Afghanistan is the reason why. Okay, there are about 1.5 million Afghan refugees in Pakistan in 2016. I will say that the broader context of this paper, we started working on this in 2020 and 2021. The sort of backdrop of the policy for us today to be thinking about is that in 2023, there was a change in Pakistan's treatment of Afghan refugees, and their plan was to effectively expel all of them from the country. And so what you should be thinking of is this is a policy intervention that's historical that might give us evidence to think about potential consequences of a crisis that's unfolding today. Okay. All right. So there's a... You can ask questions if you would like. Yeah, please. Yeah. Hans.
Also the context in Afghanistan now
Yeah.
is very different, right?
That's right. Yeah. The context is very different now. And so I think that's actually, if we were to, so this is paper 1. Paper 2 is about a series of sanctions that occur, maximum pressures, U.S. sanctions on Iran, which actually causes a comparable shock, but it's in the subset that's actually not assisted. And so it leads to a massive wave of return in 2019, 2020 that's actually not supported by a program. And what we end up seeing is the inverse of a lot of these results. So they're returning, they're less likely to be exposed to communal violence, but they're significantly more likely to engage in violence, insurgent violence, which is compensated violence, because they no longer have that opportunity cost mechanism. Now, what's happening, which might be paper 3, with the 2023 wave of return, is that indeed these are individuals who receive some assistance, but not nearly as much as during the period that we're studying here, but they're also returning to a very different context, right? They're returning to an Afghanistan that is now ruled by the Taliban, where there are significantly fewer opportunities to engage in insurgent violence, but more opportunities to engage in criminality, right? And so again, yeah, context absolutely matters, and like the period where the policy occurs matters too. Okay, so you might be thinking, why study the event that occurs here in Pakistan during this period? Well, this is return that's induced by a cash assistance program. I think it's crucial to think about what is the run up to the 2016 policy. So, at the end of 2014, sadly, there's a school massacre that's led by the TTP, which is the Pakistan Taliban. There is very, very limited evidence of any Afghan Taliban participation in the planning, coordination, or execution of that particular attack. However, it gave Pakistani authorities an opportunity and an opening to really push for the expulsion of Afghan refugees back to their home country. In 2015 and 2016, Pakistan threatens the expiration of the refugee cards, which led to internal secret negotiations within UNHCR. And then unexpectedly on June 29th of 2016, the repatriation assignment doubled, right? So cash payments went from $200 per returnee to $400 overnight, which led to this wave that you see here, right? So if you go back historically, these are of course across years, you'll notice that there is no other period of time to decide what occurs in 2023 with this expulsion policy from Pakistan. There's no other comparable wave of return that happens that's induced by an explicit policy mechanism. So that massive shock there is primarily registered return, and so individuals who would be eligible for assistance. All right, so what does this scale of assistance mean? I think this ends up being crucial for our findings. So the median family is going to receive about $3,600, which if we translate that into available evidence that we have from the time, so 2016, that is about an entire fighting season worth of income. So a little bit more about the context. You should know that most Taliban fighters at the time are just part-time fighters. They activate for several weeks or several months, then they deactivate, return to their home community, they wait out for the next fighting season, and then they can be mobilized again. This ends up being effectively an entire fighting season worth of income all at once transferred to the family as they return. There's primarily a head. The head would otherwise be the individual engaged in violence. And so effectively you might think that for the average family this buys off a primary person from engaging in violence. Yeah.
So it was always lump sum, or were there also deferred payments?
Good, yeah. So sometimes it's a lump sum, sometimes it's split based off of certain points along the path. The only time it would be split into 2 payments. Yeah. So you would be eligible for one, you need to show up at another site to collect the second half, which you could only do if you had actually returned. Yeah. And so another way of thinking about this in terms of at an individual level, so the cash assistance is about 79% of the annual Afghan GDP per capita. For a part-time fighter, it's about 133%. In terms of like the monthly returnee, their wage at a low level, it's more than 5 times that. If they were a high-wage returnee, it's almost 3 times what they would otherwise receive, and it's 2.5 times the national wage. And of course, if you think about this at a family scale, it's often always families returning together. It's the equivalent of an entire fighting season of income. Now, some things that we can do to kind of cross-validate, because it could just be that this coincided with another shock, is that we have lots of survey evidence from the time, which includes data from beneficiaries as well as non-beneficiaries that allows us to assess whether or not indeed it was the assistance program that enabled them to return, and that is the case. Okay, and this is the evidence here. All right. I know we're a little short on time, so I just wanted to talk a little bit more about the process because Felipe asked this great question. Right, so you have there are registration sites where you have to go. So these are basically receiving centers. You then cross over a border. Then you end up at your encashment center where resources are transferred, and then you end up at your destination. Okay. Now, what we're going to take advantage of here is the stated location of intended return. That doesn't necessarily mean the individuals are there, but you should internalize this is effectively like an intention to treat design. Yeah.
Was it expected to have such a high elasticity? You double basically the cash incentive from 200 to 400, and then the number of returnees like is multiplied by 5 or 10. So the elasticity is massive in a sense. So was it expected, or is it another push factor basically to smooth that?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if it was necessarily expected, but I think that what this revealed is likely that they could have done significantly less and achieved some fractional response. But the doubling enabled many families who were on the margin to actually make the choice to return. This is also a period, sort of backdrop, is that they had an incentive to exit as well, just generally, which is that in 2015 and 2016, hostilities are at an all-time high. Right, so given the opportunity, they would want to leave, and it turns out that the doubling is what enabled many of them to leave. But I think that no, they didn't expect that it would be this big. Yeah. Okay, so a little bit about the design. A crucial element of what we can do here. Who's keeping time? It's like the Spider-Man meme over here. Okay. All right, terrific. So in order to pull off the design, we need lots of core inputs that are really difficult to achieve in an unstable environment like this, one of which is that the data that we previously utilized for studying, for example, the security transition with Oliver, for studying election violence in Afghanistan, that data comes from the period before 2015, so before the end of the primary U.S. operations. However, during this period of time, 2016 and later, Endure, which is the International Distributed Unified Reporting Environment, is actually still utilized. And so ANSF, in order to qualify for funds, has to upload all of their military records. And we have advantage by being able to access all of those records. And if you look at the data, it's incredibly granular. It's about the scale of the SIGACs that we saw during the period from 2001 to 2015. And includes information that wasn't previously in the SIGACs release that we had from the Department of Defense. We can talk more about that if you'd like. I think that's like a tremendous resource that with the paper will come an opportunity for researchers who are thinking about what happens after the U.S. actually leaves Afghanistan. Okay, so we also have survey-based measures of communal conflict and discrimination. This is otherwise incredibly difficult to see into communities, and fortunately, this is information specifically about returnees, individuals who were previously exposed to displacement, and that includes information about their experiences of exposure to sort of interpersonal disputes, so within community, across individual disputes, things like discrimination, whether or not their neighbors actually invite the returnees to participate in communal events, and their perceptions of their neighbors as helpful, respectful, and friendly, right? And so, in some sense, this is like exactly what you would want to test, right? Because it allows us to understand both these sort of like granular low levels of hostility, as well as the potential for the things that are economically meaningful, like discrimination in the workplace, and these interpersonal disputes that might otherwise be really hard to see unless you have police records, which in this period are incomplete. Okay. We also have, I will say, Anouk, who's in the audience, pointed out some weaknesses of this, but we were able to build out a communal conflict data set based off of some proprietary data collected by the U.S. government at the time. We have a lot more confidence in the survey data than we do in that. Okay. All right, so the repatriation data comes from UNHCR. This is going to come from the period of 2013 to 2014, and we're going to combine that with the wave of return that we see in 2016. It turns out that base period doesn't quite matter all that much. Much about the historical settlement pattern means we could use previous years as well. And that returnee survey is granular data given to us, thankfully, from the Asia Foundation. And so what we're going to try and do is take advantage of the fact that there is this temporal shock, this sort of overnight shift, right, that induces an unexpectedly large wave of return. And that, of course, our cross-sectional variation is going to come from the fact that many of these individuals will follow historical settlement patterns in terms of engagement. And so that means that we can take advantage of the sort of share of return that's going to be allocated across the country following historical lines. And so for our behavioral outcomes, what we're going to be taking advantage of is looking at that shock times the sort of shift across space, as well as when we start looking at our survey outcomes, it's going to be slightly different design. There it's at an individual level, and so we could take advantage of the fact that based off of the period of repatriation, certain individuals would or would not have qualified for the encashment program, and therefore would or would not have been exposed to discrimination and disputes. So what do we end up finding? Well, it turns out contemporary patterns of return very much map to historical patterns of return. So there's sort of path dependence in the network of return, which is useful for us because then we can use our reduced form design. So what do we end up finding? Well, if you look on the left side here, is sort of a simple event study design that allows us to think about a little bit about those pre-trends. In terms of the extensive margin of violence, there's not that much that's going on in terms of those communities that are going to experience a wave of return that occurs with our vertical bar. And if you look at the intensive margin, that's going to be a little bit more. So there's a slight downward tick right before, but then it actually reverts back right before the policy really kicks in. Okay. Now, one thing I will emphasize, though, is that if you remember the figure I showed you earlier, there's a sort of a mountain shape to the distribution, right? What we're going to think of as the entire post period as being treated, even though actually the wave of return occurs across time and is a little staggered. But for our purposes, I think it's probably useful for us to err on the side of caution and just estimate average effects in the post period. Okay. So what do we end up finding? Well, there are significant decreases both in terms of the extensive margin and in terms of the rate and intensity of conflict in terms of insurgent violence with the program itself, right? And in terms of baseline numbers, right, these are actually non-trivial effects in terms of their actual reduction. Now, there are a number of things that we could do to kind of push the model a little bit more, right? So the baseline specification, as you would anticipate, it includes both like unit and time fixed effects. It's also going to account for fixed effects that are specific to each of the different UNHCR areas, so the encashment zones that Felipe was asking about earlier. And then there's also a number of things that we might take into account given the context, right, which is both the ethnic landscape tribal landscape, as well as things like the interventions related to development, agricultural outcomes, and reconstruction. And of course, we might also want to think about lags in the outcome, right? And so, as you'll see here, the results are actually rather durable across the specifications, which we think is promising in terms of its robustness. Okay. Now, at a high level, though, although you do see that reduction in insurgent violence, you do see an increase in communal violence, right? And so here you should be thinking that the higher levels are actually better community relations. And so this is a returnee kind of relations index. And so the decline here is indicative of worsening local community conditions. And so remember, this one is not at the administrative unit level. This one is at the individual level. We're taking advantage of the fact that based off of when they return, individuals would or not have been eligible to experience that cash assistance program. And indeed, those that return during this particular wave are exposed to significantly more communal harm. Okay. Where communal harm here is what I showed you earlier, right? It's their exposure to low-level disputes, discrimination in the workplace, worsening community ties, and things like that. Okay. All right, so a few things. Why might it be the case that we see that reduction in insurgent violence? One of the ways for us to think about this is that, well, these are encashed individuals, right? That positive economic shock should actually sort of raise some of the opportunity costs for engaging in mobilization. And indeed, it's not just the case that the individual recipients got the benefit. It's a sufficiently large scale in terms of the transfer that it might actually have intra-communal externalities. And so that means spillovers across households just because of the scale of that. And so one way to think about this is that it could be the case that constrained insurgents therefore kind of substitute from labor-intensive violence, because now the cost of mobilization of labor is increasing with the scale of this assistance program. They would shift from recruiting individuals to instead relying on the individuals they already have and investing in capital-intensive attacks. And indeed, that's what we find. And so if you take a look, this is again that overall shock that I showed you earlier, that we saw that declining with the policy intervention. All of that decline is coming off of direct fire attacks. So for those of you all who are kind of deep in this literature, direct fire attacks are kind of ambush style attacks, usually done in small teams, right? So this is going to be the most labor intensive of all the types of violence in Afghanistan at the time. And you're seeing that labor intensive violence is actually what's driving the overall reduction in violence. However, perhaps like most problematically, you're actually seeing an increase in the deployment of IEDs. Okay, and so again, this is during the period of time. The most deadly form of violence, if you're a civilian, is exposure to IEDs. And so this is evidence of substitution. So the net effect, like the overall effect, is a reduction in violence, but actually underneath the hood is a shift in the violence itself towards capital-intensive violence. And unfortunately, what we're going to find is that with that, both there's a reduction in the lethality of those labor-intensive attacks, but a significant increase in the lethality of those IED attacks, which suggests that they're investing heavily in the IEDs that they're building during the period of time, right? So again, the program not affecting the budget of the Taliban. It is, however, affecting their ability to mobilize fighters. Because it's now binding on their ability to mobilize fighters, they instead mobilize resources. The resources that they mobilize become more sophisticated and become actually more harmful overall. Okay, and so if you look at lethality, this is this first column here, even though overall violence is going down, the negative consequences of that violence that remains is actually significantly worse. Okay, yeah.
Any evidence that the Taliban extracted some of this cash?
So. Yeah, so it is possible that they extracted some of that cash. I think that would have like a countervailing effect, right? So then what we probably would see here is like a downwardly biased effect. But there is some like informal evidence, but we have no way of tracking that, right? Yeah. Now, one other thing that we might want to test is that there are other effects of sort of increasing resources. It's both going to make it harder for you to recruit fighters if you're the insurgency. It turns out that counterinsurgents also want to buy information, and so now the cost of buying information is also going to go up, right, which would impact the ability for counterinsurgents to engage in warfighting. So you should think about this cash assistance program as having effects that both undermine the insurgency and, by extension, are actually also going to undermine the counterinsurgency as well, because the price of tips is going to go up, right? And so what we're going to find, indeed, is evidence of that. And so we can take advantage of the fact that the military records that we have access to include details about clearance missions that are primarily driven by the flow of information from civilians. And those clearance missions are significantly declining, which suggests that the civilian community in that area with this assistance program is actually sharing significantly less information with the counterinsurgents, even as the market for information, the amount of information that could be shared, is actually increasing, right? And so this is a rather unfortunate situation, right? So it makes it harder to actually clear the fields. Okay, and the last piece, and then I'll wrap up, is to say that just because this intervention had net positive effects on violence overall, and had net negative effects in terms of communal violence, doesn't mean that there isn't anything that we can do from a sort of policy for peace perspective. Indeed, what we find is that informal governance, especially strong local governance and social capital, can actually offset some of those negative effects. And so think about this as strong local leaders, strong local institutions might actually provide a buffer against the worst possible features of a mass-scale return like this by basically thwarting effects on disputes and enabling them to manage things like kinship networks and dispute resolution. And indeed, that's what we find, right? So we have a variety of ways that we can think about actually measuring some of these characteristics. So measuring access, for example, to social capital is going to offset some of those pernicious effects. And that's true both in terms of a sort of classical way of measuring like connectedness to the community, as well as just using like simple geography, as well as using access to local councils, right? Access to local elders who might engage in dispute resolution, as well as certain situations, and this kind of gets to Hannes, what's underneath Hannes' question earlier, the fact that during this period of time, actually the Taliban was engaging in dispute resolution, they actually became one of these institutions that could offset some of those negative effects, okay? All right. And so this paper really is the first that we're aware of that provides causal evidence of the impact of a mass-scale return induced by a policy change, its effect on violence and instability. And of course, you know, there are varieties of different kinds of violence that could be impacted, both political and social, and we see these kind of distortionary effects in both directions. You know, cash can induce repatriation, as we saw. It turns out like pretty quickly like ramped up. I think a nice exercise that could be done is to better calibrate what amount of cash assistance is needed to kind of tip the marginal individual, because what that wave could have actually been incredibly problematic, and from a policy making perspective might not have actually been optimal. And the last thing, of course, that we find is that the cash assistance programs, if they're kind of used, might actually restrain insurgents from engaging in violence by constraining their ability to recruit. But of course, that's also going to bind on counterinsurgents, which could have long-lasting negative effects. And the last piece of evidence that we saw is evidence that indeed there are policies that we can use tethered to the existence of repatriation programs to offset some of those negative consequences. And so thank you for that. And I don't think we have time for questions, but maybe we do. Perhaps one. All right, Hans.
I think there's a knife, right?
Thank you. So yeah, great. I mean, this is super interesting. I'm wondering, isn't it like a terrible policy to pay people to go back into a civil war? Like, shouldn't we wait until the war is over? And like, right? I think also ethically, thinking about the policy here, it's really, I think it's unethical to do this, right? So you're dangling money in front of them and say like, you go back, and then you send them back into this really ongoing thing where they're in harm's way. So I was wondering, like, do you have thinking about this? Like, would this policy also help in kind of like when there's a political agreement actually first, right? Political agreement first, then people would come back anyway, perhaps, probably, and that leads to my second question: are people returning right now, or are the Taliban so terrible that nobody's even now returning? So that's my two questions.
Yeah. So I will say that we have sat with the ethics of this for a while, right? And I think that, in this context, one way to think about this is it's probably a little bit closer to what you ended your question with, which is that if they are already going to return, under what conditions would we like for them to return? And so that's the case in 2023, right? There's a mass wave of both exit and return that happens around 2021. And now during this period, there was uncertainty about what the Pakistani government would do in the absence of this program. Right, so it's kind of hard to kind of game through the ethics of all of these like counterfactual policies. But I think, if anything, if you're in a scenario where you anticipate there will be some return, you might as well enable those who are returning to be as successful as possible. And this is some evidence that maybe the additional assistance both buys them the opportunity to return with ease and gives them opportunity to avoid engaging in criminality or the unproductive part of the economy, at least for a period of time. So I think that there is definitely some benefit there. Remind me, what was your second question?
Are people returning right now?
Are they returning right now? So the answer is yes. And they are returning with assistance. It is not assistance-induced return. This is primarily return induced from uncertainty in the situation between. I have to bear in mind we're live streaming this, and I don't want to put anybody on the operations team at risk. But there's a lot of uncertainty about the situation in Pakistan right now.
Yeah, I think we should keep like other questions for the break.
Okay. Well, please, yes. So I will say, this is a part of an ongoing project, as we said. Right, there are a series of things that come out of this. Right, like I'm deeply invested in understanding these consequences, and if you have, especially questions related to ethics and econometrics, I'm all for them. Right, so please bring them during the break. Looking forward to that. Thank you.